So, we're talking about vulnerability. My intention with this newsletter and certainly this video is to be more vulnerable and to practice the art of vulnerability in order to share myself and my reflections and my study and to connect with others in this juicy, vulnerable human experience that we are all in. In an attempt to understand vulnerability, um, radically in contrast to what the dictionary tells us it is, my brain wanted to come up with an equation for vulnerability, and it came up with this. Vulnerability equals courage with the self plus trust plus courage with the other. And I will break down the aspects of this equation as I talk more in this video. Another thing that I will be referencing is the zones of reaction, which is a beautiful lens and tool that I walked away with from a wellness and healing justice retreat that I just came out of. Pretty much the model says that we have 3 zones of reaction to the people and situations in our lives. I have a graphic below this video detailing the zones so that you can see it visually. At the center is the comfort zone. This is the place where we are, of course, comfortable. Things are easy, familiar. We are relaxed here. There's not a whole lot of challenge. Thereby, there's not a whole lot of growth that happens here. We're kind of just going with what we know. Then there's the stretch zone. The stretch zone is when we expand our horizons a little bit, where we venture into new territory with different people, with some unfamiliarity. This is where a lot of growth happens. It's where we're able to take in the lessons that are offered to us in our lives without being dysregulated or withdrawn from it. We are still able to have control of ourselves, to feel rooted and grounded, while also being exposed to newness around us. Then there's the panic zone. The panic zone is when we are dysregulated, shut down, withdrawn, in fight, flight, freeze, or appease mode, when we are really just trying to survive or even just appealing to the people around us in order to keep the peace. Not a whole lot of growth happens here. It's actually very stressful, and sometimes many of us live a big chunk of our lives in this zone without even realizing it until we find some peace. The thing with these zones is that everyone's zones are different. Someone's comfort zone may be someone's panic zone. Someone's stretch zone may be someone's panic zone as well. And I am bringing in this lens to invite reflection on which zones we're in with different situations and people in our lives, such that we can better assess when is good to be vulnerable. It's not great to be vulnerable in panic zone. There's probably a reason why we're there, and being vulnerable will only make us probably more panicky or stressed out. It's great to be vulnerable in stretch zone because we're out of our comfort zone, we're in something new or different, and there is still some semblance of safety, but also some risk associated with it. And vulnerability, so much so, is dealing with uncertainty and risk. So consider that. I will definitely be bringing in my stretch, comfort, and panic zones in the examples that I offer. Now, the definitions of vulnerability are as follows. According to the dictionary, vulnerability is the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed either physically or emotionally. So, a very clear bias towards the dangers associated with vulnerability. Dr. Brené Brown, a renowned researcher on the topic of vulnerability, shame, courage, and intimacy, redefines vulnerability simply as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She talks a lot about how vulnerability does leave us prone to judgment and criticism, and also it helps us deepen into intimacy and creative and emotional freedom. So I will be approaching vulnerability from a more multifaceted approach, considering both the deep benefits and the dangers of being vulnerable. So why be vulnerable? Being vulnerable definitely deepens and creates intimacy. When I was in grad school, I was plagued by imposter syndrome for at least the first 4 months. Every day that I walked into class, I was in panic zone. I was dysregulated. Toxic narratives were blasting in my head about how I wasn't smart enough, participatory enough, empathetic enough, compassionate enough. It was very overwhelming, and I wasn't able to share this experience with anybody. And therefore, there was a wall between me and everyone there because I perceived them as so much more capable and adequate and belonging. Second trimester came along, and we were in a class called Multicultural Awareness and Sensitivity, where we were challenged to slow down and focus on body language, to reflect on our biases and our perceptions of various dimensions of identity. And so, in my group of 5 other peers and my professor and advisor at the time, we were sharing from our hearts, speaking with a lot of presence and mindfulness for what our true experiences were. And the only thing that I could come up with were these feelings that were within me for so long about how I simply just didn't feel like I belonged and that I wasn't good enough to be training to become a therapist. So, through a lot of hot tears flowing down my face, I was able to reveal that I felt imposter syndrome. And I was met with so much compassion and validation and affirmation. People expressed that they too shared similar feelings, that they were surprised that I was feeling that way because I had offered so much to their experience so far just by being who I was. And my experience after that shifted completely, such that every time I walked into class thereafter, I was no longer in panic zone. I was in stretch zone as I remembered that I'm not alone in my feelings and that I was able to show a part of my real self to my peers without being criticized or outwardly judged or rejected. I was also able to establish deeper relationships with everyone in my group because I showed them a part of myself and opened space for that practice of showing who we are and sharing our reality and our truths at the time, however they looked. Another thing is I've been watching a lot of Insecure lately on HBO with Issa Rae, and I think that show does such an impeccable job showing how our vulnerabilities or how the characters' vulnerabilities manifest and how we can be amazing, phenomenal women and men and also vulnerable and insecure, and that we are complex beings seeking for growth and clarity in our lives. So I think if Issa Rae, for example, was not vulnerable and courageous enough with her own insecurities, a show like Insecure or Awkward Black Girl would not exist. And in order to be able to create from that place of authenticity, we need to accept that part of ourselves. And that part takes a whole lot of courage to be able to see the parts that we're vulnerable around and to accept it enough to share it. So being vulnerable is also an exploration of self and self-discovery. It asks for us to release shame around certain dimensions of identity, especially the ones that we tend to hide, like our shadows. And that facing our shadows and facing the parts of ourselves that are really sensitive is a radically courageous act. And that might be a reason why we sometimes don't want to be vulnerable. It is an active practice and a constant practice every day. So my friend Ashley Ross, who is a body therapist and a very nurturing warrior woman spirit, whose contact information I included below in case you're in LA and wanting a lovely therapist, shared with me the metaphor of the oyster and the pearl in relation to vulnerability. So how a pearl is actually formed is when a foreign particle enters the shell of an oyster, the oyster covers that particle with layers of nacre. Nacre is also known as the mother of pearl and is the substance that makes up the shell, the shiny part of the shell. And so the oyster covers the particle with layers and layers of nacre so as to protect its very delicate layer of meat inside, thereby rendering the pearl. The metaphor is that the pearl is the defense or adaptation that the oyster has created in order to protect itself. Relating to us, as we make our way through our lives, different things happen to us that require us to form protections around ourselves. These pearls are neither bad nor good. These defenses or adaptations are neither bad nor good. They are just what they were, and for a while they really served us. And then there comes a time where it's actually just stagnating us and taking up space in our shells, and we need to let go of it. And that is how we're being vulnerable. We're being vulnerable by letting go of our pearls and letting it free and letting it be. And I really like that metaphor, and for me it's served me a lot in thinking about it, and I hope it does for you too. Vulnerability requires us to ask, what identities are we trying to preserve? How are we trying to be an ideal self versus just a real authentic self? When we're vulnerable, parts of our identity come to the spotlight that we normally try to hide. And in this way, it's super courageous to be able to do that. Zadie Smith said, faith involves an acceptance of absurdity. I think this relates so closely to being vulnerable, because in order to be vulnerable and to have faith in being vulnerable, we need to accept the absurd parts of ourselves and release it. We need to ask ourselves if there's a question of safety, and we need to know what conditions we need in place in order to be vulnerable. Is there some semblance of safety and trust and compassion from others whom we want to be vulnerable around? It's an important question to ask. What data has the people or situations around us given us to prove that we can trust and be safe with them? Sometimes, I know for me certainly, my mind makes up all kinds of stories as to why I cannot trust them, when in actuality and in reality, they have given me nothing to distrust. And so parsing apart the two cognitively is really important, and assessing reality as it is versus the various stories that our brains want to make up based on previous situations or actually unrelated experiences. Another way to assess safety is to consult with our bodies. Our bodies offer so much information and so much wisdom that help us assess whether we are safe or can be safe and can trust. So my friend Ashley recommended that we remember in our bodies, not just in our heads, but remember a time when we were safe, when we felt safe with somebody. Perhaps this could be even a time where we felt safe, but in our stretch zone, where we were in a new place or with somebody new, yet still felt safe. How did it feel like in our bodies? How did our breath feel? How did our shoulders feel? How did our jaws and our eyes feel? Knowing what safety feels like in our bodies will help us as a reference point for when we're in other situations to assess how safe or trusting we feel. Trust also includes trust and faith in our own absurdity or our own truth, whatever it is, no matter how consistent or inconsistent it is with our environment. Trusting both in our own truths and also in the situation at hand. Trusting in the opportunity offered to us to be vulnerable in any given situation. If we are put on the spot for something or given an opportunity to speak or to sing, can we trust in that situation and step into it and say yes to it? Or do we want to not only not be vulnerable, but close off and distrust it? Ultimately, though, whether or not there is a large amount of trust there, it takes courage, yet again, with the other, with whomever you're sharing yourself with, to speak up anyway, to sing even if you're shaking, or even if you are forgetting the lines, which I recently did. Singing in front of people is probably one of the most vulnerable things that I could do, and it always feels good to do it when I do it, because I am hyper aware of how safe I am when I sing. Um, but yes, it takes another level of courage to put ourselves out there, really until we realize that we're indestructible. So, with that all being said, um, when we feel stuck, it might be a really good time to ask and reflect, how can I be vulnerable? Or how am I protecting myself that might actually be stagnating me? I've included below some questions to journal about to deepen into that courage with self and that trust, and ideally that courage with the other. Um, I am very much on this journey of vulnerability and courage with self and other as well, and so I hope that some of the things that I shared here has some resonance, or you can walk away with something to think about. And if you've made it through this video, many, many thanks to you in this day and age where our attention spans are oftentimes not passing 2 minutes, myself included. I am really impressed that you were able to get through this. And if you did, there must be some resonance with my energy and you. And I would recommend that we work more together. I am offering a bunch of workshops in Chicago and the Bay Area in the next coming weeks, and I would love to meet you in person. I'm also offering a sliding scale one-to-one self-development consultation that can be done digitally or in person. And if I resonate with you, I would love to work with you. So please reach out to me. I'm so grateful for this community that I have here with this newsletter. I'm so grateful for this opportunity and the safe space to be vulnerable myself. I hope that I can inspire you to reflect on how you can be vulnerable, and I would so love to hear how you decide to do that. In the meantime, much love and thank you.